Let's go back to our flowchart now and start by establishing the business goals. There's an old expression that every project must start from the beginning. And if you're involved in a project to acquire office space, then you need to know what is driving it and, more importantly, how it will help your company succeed. Let's start with a simple question. Why are you doing this? Seems like a silly question, but it's not. Even if you're the CEO, you still need to ask it. Ask your advisors and ask yourself. And the quality of your answer will reveal the depth of your understanding. Are you doing this because you need more space? If so, how do you know you need more space? How do you know you can't grow within your existing space by reconfiguring, or by switching from dedicated workstations to flexible workstations, or by changing your remote work policy? All of those things would allow you to increase your headcount without taking on more square footage. So ask this question and keep asking it until you understand the core driver of the project. Do you know how long you'll need the space? This is often tough to answer because it's based on the growth and contraction of the company, but you need, at the very least, a general sense of how long you will occupy the space. More importantly, are we all on the same page? This can be a challenge in any size company, but particularly in a bigger company, where you sometimes have a disconnect between the business unit leaders and the executives. For example, the business unit leader might be pushing for more space to grow his or her department, while the CFO is insisting on less space to cut costs. If you see this kind of misalignment, then do your best to address it. If you're the CEO, then discuss it with both sides and make the decision. If you're lower on the totem pole, then try to arrange a meeting or a conference call with everyone to discuss the issues. Play the role of the mediator. It's not easy, but if you don't have agreement on the goal, then serious problems can arise as you get deeper into the process. Your next step is to figure out exactly what you need. In the industry, we refer to this as your requirement. The importance of understanding your requirement is often underappreciated, and sometimes people begin their search without much analysis or discussion. The risk is that you'll waste a lot of time touring and analyzing spaces that don't make sense. If you're an executive, then your time is valuable and you need to use it strategically. So it's worthwhile to do some analysis up front to save yourself time later. But even if you're lower on the totem pole, in my opinion, you should have the same attitude. If you're asked to spend your time searching for a new location, then it's fair for you to politely push for a deeper understanding of exactly what your company needs. It's not uncommon for a directive to come from senior management that makes its way down the food chain without being challenged or fully understood. This can create a tremendous waste of time. So whether you're a CEO or a junior manager in the real estate department, you should go through the following steps before you begin your search. What is your company culture? Culture is not a well-defined concept, but you can be sure that everyone has an opinion. And when you're leasing office space, people will often care deeply that the space reflects the culture of the company. The definition of company culture is fraught with platitudes and buzzwords. Framed statements adorn the walls of countless corporations with words like trust, reliability, honesty, and collaboration. If you ask people, either managers or executives, to describe an office space that reflects their company's culture, you will hear a wide variety of descriptions. More importantly, even when people tour a space that is exactly what they described, they often aren't satisfied. The reason being that defining culture in words can be quite challenging. In this case, I recommend relying on the old adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words. You can probably look at the photos on this slide and immediately have an opinion about which one of these spaces might work well for your company, and perhaps which ones would be terrible. In my opinion, this is the most effective way to understand what type of space you want. If you're an executive and you're assigning the search to someone, then find photos of the space you like and give them to that person. You can also reference a space you've been in and instruct that person to go there and see it. If you're the one being assigned the project, then print out photos, take them to your boss and ask, which of these is the type of space we're looking for? It will save time and lead to a better end result. One of the most fundamental issues is knowing how much space you need, and that starts with estimating your head count. The number of people you need to accommodate will tell you the amount of space that you need. This can be a bit tricky because you have to forecast, and looking into the future is always challenging. You need to estimate how far into the future you can see, or perhaps a more accurate way to put it is how far into the future you're willing to plan. If this space needs to accommodate your company for the next 5 years, then you'll have to estimate the number of employees who will occupy that space for the next 5 years. Be prepared for disagreement on this issue. Projections are difficult and often wrong, and people within your company may have different agendas. In these situations, key metrics can be helpful. A commonly used metric for estimating needed square footage is square feet per person. With this, you can take the number of people who will occupy the space and translate that into a square footage. For example, if you need space for 100 people and you know that you need 200 square feet per person, that means you'll need 20,000 square feet. Or if you're considering a space that's 25,000 square feet, you know you can accommodate up to 125 people in that space. If you need help creating this metric, then an architect or a space planner can help you. But I'll also give you a quick and dirty method of estimating it. Simply look at the number of people you have now and the size of the space you're in. Let's say, for example, you have 40 people in 10,000 square feet. That would mean you're using 250 square feet per person. And if you wanted to go from 40 to 100 people, then you're going to need 25,000 square feet. That estimate assumes that you're fully utilizing your space and that you're happy with the flow. So if you have 40 people in 10,000 square feet and it's half empty, then you're not using 250 square feet per person. Or if it's full but it feels really spread out, then you can probably condense down to a smaller ratio. Another example of a similar metric is the number of people for every 1,000 square feet of space. For example, to accommodate 100 people at 5 per 1,000, you would need 20,000 square feet. Headcount projections are challenging, but do your best to make a good estimate so that you can feel confident about the amount of space you need. The next step in defining your requirement is to do some space programming. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, it has nothing to do with the Apollo mission, Sputnik, or the Hubble telescope. It's actually the much more difficult task of translating your headcount projections and office functions into design criteria. At this point, you know approximately how many people you need to accommodate, and you know what functions they perform. For example, sales, marketing, finance, legal, HR. And based on that criteria, you'll need to figure out what design elements you need. This doesn't necessarily mean creating an actual mock space plan, which is fine to do if you find it helpful. It means determining things like the number of private offices you'll need, or cubicles, conference rooms, meeting rooms, and so on. This will give you an even better read on the size of space you need, and later, when you're touring space, it will help you understand how much construction is required for each potential location. I highly recommend using an architect or a space planner for this step. It may seem straightforward, but I can assure you that it's quite easy to make a big mistake that will either add cost or complication to your project. I probably don't need to sell you on the importance of location. I think most people understand that it's an essential part of making a good real estate decision. What I recommend at this point in the process is only looking at the big picture. You haven't started looking at individual buildings yet, so for now you can focus on regions. The common things to consider are the following: the labor pool, the cost of spaces, any incentives that might be provided by the local municipality, access like public transportation and how good the freeway access is, amenities like restaurants, the business environment, and proximity to your key customers. Get a general sense of not only where you want to be, but also areas you want to avoid. If you don't have access to that information, then I recommend using your broker. He or she can provide data on most of these points and can also describe any market trends that you might want to consider. By far, the most common mistake I see people make when working on a lease acquisition is getting the timing wrong. Start by understanding the key driver of your timing. For example, is it your current lease expiration date? In other words, is there a date when you will be required to move out of your space? Or is it tied to a particular customer? Or is it more about your growth trajectory? In other words, do you need to accommodate more headcount within a certain time frame? A great way to estimate timing is to create a timeline. Here's an example of one. This shows a list of tasks to be done for a lease acquisition. Each filled-in square represents 1 week. If you find it difficult to create this, then your broker can assist you. I should point out that this timeline includes some tasks that are not covered in this course. Those are the bottom 3 items under facility delivery. This course ends here, at lease execution. The reason I'm showing you the facility delivery section is so that you can see what a real timeline looks like. Also, you might notice that my timeline is a bit longer than you would expect. This project is 10 months from conception to occupancy. This is actually a typical time frame for a medium-sized office lease, so make sure you plan accordingly before you start. It's very difficult to create a budget at this point in the process because you haven't studied the market yet. However, I understand that in many cases a budget estimate is required before you begin a project. If you have a general idea of location and size, you can get a very rough estimate from your broker about the cost. You may also need to budget for building out the space, which is very difficult without knowing its condition. Have a conversation with your project manager, and he or she can probably give you some rough numbers. The most important thing at this stage is to keep the budget flexible and then update it as you go. Most people haven't thought about the siding entity at this stage, and it may seem trivial, but I can assure you it's not. The second you start negotiating, the landlord will insist on knowing the specific entity that is signing the lease. It will impact the terms of the lease and can even determine whether you're allowed to lease the space at all, particularly if you're competing with another prospective tenant. If you're a subsidiary of a larger company, then you should inquire about a guarantee from your parent company. There might be a charge for that, but it can be worthwhile. If you're the owner of a small company with a weak balance sheet, then the landlord might ask you to personally guarantee the lease. I would avoid that if you can, but under certain circumstances it might be worth it. My general point here is that you should investigate this before you start the process and know what you're willing to do. If you've gone through all the steps I just covered, then you should have a good idea of what your company needs. This is the last slide for the section on defining your requirement, and I included it for people who work at larger companies with a more complex decision-making process. It will serve you well to have the decision makers sign off on the key points of the project before you start. The main reasons are that it forces people to agree on the goal of the project, and it can sometimes bring previously unknown issues to the surface. And then there's one final reason to get a form like this signed. For those of you who aren't familiar with the acronym CYA, I'm going to let you look that up on the internet. This document can be quite useful to anyone who has been involved in a project where the goalpost keeps getting moved. I understand it's not easy to ask people to sign something, but if you're the one getting blamed if you don't deliver on what was requested, it might be worthwhile to document what was requested.